I want you to close your eyes for a minute and imagine yourself on the deck of the British blockade runner Condor out of Southport bound for Wilmington, North Carolina. Those of you up on board may have noticed a rather tall, elegant looking lady on deck at times. And why, ladies and gentlemen, there she is.
I don't believe I know any of you people. I think all of you must have gotten on this ship, the Condor, in Nova Scotia when we stopped there. I think that all of the good people that had boarded with me in England must have gotten off there. But maybe since you are running the blockade with me, your loyalties lie with the South. I hope they do. Would you stand up, sir? Since I don't believe I'm acquainted with anyone on this ship, would you be so kind as to introduce me? My name is Mrs. Rose Greenhow. Pleased to meet you. Would you present me to people gathered here on the deck?
Oh, this is Miss
Rose?
Rose O'Neill Greenhow.
Yes. Thank you so much. When I boarded this ship, I had this foreboding feeling come over me that I might never see my loved ones again. And because Captain Hewitt, that gentleman over there, has informed me that we're going to reach Wilmington before morning, I've decided that tonight I should tell my story to all you folks gathered here on the Condor, just in case something might happen. You never know. Would you like to hear my story? Yes. Well, I want to begin where all good stories start, in the beginning. I was born in Montgomery County, Maryland. Now, the year doesn't matter, as you ladies know. My father was a tobacco plantation owner, and I was just a few years old when he was in his cups, as they say, one night, and one of his slaves, a bondsman, hit him over the head until he was dead. My mother was left a widow with daughters to raise. Now, the man confessed to his crime and he hung for it. But there was my mother with a tobacco plantation and daughters. And so she soon remarried. And my sister Ellen and I, when we were teenagers, went to live with our aunt in Washington City, which was only about 25 miles away. But it might have been 1,000 miles for the difference to go to the city to live. But we went and lived at our aunt's boarding house called Hill's Boarding House, which was in the old Capitol building. Well, while there, we met all of the politicians of the day, all the important people that came to Washington City, the senators and the congressmen, the lobbyists, the people who wanted things, because they didn't take up residence in houses then, they just stayed at the boarding house. And so that in that way, I got to know all the most important men of the city. And I got to hear what became quite a pastime of mine, all of their gossip. And so from an early age, I filed away all this information that I would someday need. I didn't know it at the time. When we were teenagers, my sister Ellen, she was quite a belle. She attracted the eye of a very important young man, Mr. James Madison Cutts, the nephew of Dolly Madison herself. And as you know, Dolly Madison in those days was the socialite of Washington City. If you were invited to her parties, you were invited to all of the parties. And so after they were married, being somewhat of an in-law, I was invited to all the best parties of the city and made even more acquaintances and connections and heard even more of my favorite pastime, gossip. and the secrets of everyone in the city. And again, I filed those away. And then, as I grew older, I never talk about that very much. But I met my own husband, Dr. Robert Greenhow. He was a lawyer and a physician. But he soon became bored with both, and with my contacts in the politics of the day, I secured for him a position after we were married in the State Department. And after several children, unfortunately none of our sons lived, I bore Robert 8 children over the course of our marriage, only 4 of whom lived, our 4 daughters. But at the time, he was sent to Mexico City on his first assignment with the State Department. And it was said then, it was whispered, that I was sending messages back to the president in secret. Well, I was sending messages back to the president. But it was supposed to be a secret. That was my first taste of spying and passing secrets along. I found that I quite liked it. It was a thrill, Well, then Robert, after some years, was sent to San Francisco for the State Department. And I was expecting our last child. And I had returned to Washington City for what was called a laying in. And our daughter, little Rose, who I named for myself, was born. And about 10 months after I was still in Washington City with the baby, I received a letter saying that Robert had fallen from the sidewalk in San Francisco, walking to his offices, and that he had broken his leg. But they expected him to recover. I thought that I would be able to finalize all of our business there in Washington City and pack my things and go to California to join him in his recovery. But before I could do so, I received another letter saying that paralysis had set in and Robert had died. And I was left a widow with 4 daughters, one only 10 months old. Well, I decided to take up residence in Washington City, as I did consider it my home. And so I bought a house on 16th Street. And it has been said, I know some of you may have heard over the course of the last few years, that I have accepted money from certain gentlemen. But that is not so. I'll tell you now, when my husband died, the city of San Francisco settled $10,000 on me for his accident. And then the State Department, $30,000. And so I had money of my own and had no need of a man or his money. So those rumors you may have heard about me using my feminine wiles for money are not true. I may have used my feminine wiles, but it was only to extract information from men who did not sympathize with the South. Well, I settled into my house there on 16th Street, and as the years passed, and then in 1860, when that black Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected, well, I had made no secret of where my sympathies lie. With the South, of course. My mentor, John C. Calhoun, had taught me about secession and states' rights. I'm a Southern woman, born with revolutionary blood. And my first crude ideas about state and federal matters were given shape and consistency by the best and wisest man of this century, John C. Calhoun. So I knew that freedom of speech and of thought were my birthright. as an American. And they were given to me by our Charter of Freedom, the Constitution, and paid for in the blood of my forefathers. So after Lincoln's election, as I said, I had made no secret of my sympathies with the Southern cause. At my parties now, I was the socialite in Washington City that everyone wanted to be invited to my parties. I would invite my northern-leaning friends, if you may call them that, and my southern-leaning friends. You should have heard all the secrets told at my table, and some of the just comments that were not very nice, aimed at each other over the politics of the day. Now, this was before the war broke out. But then, in the spring of '61, after South Carolina had seceded, and Virginia was well on her way, my daughter Layla, my middle child, only 23 years old, she fell ill with typhoid fever right there in my house on 16th Street. And she died, and once again I was in mourning. I kept her toilette just as she had left it there on her dresser in her room as a memory to her. Just after that, I was approached by a man in a blue uniform, a Union uniform, Captain Thomas Jordan. He came to me and he asked me if I would be willing to take on his spy ring. Well, that intrigued me. As I said, I had done a bit of message sending before, and so I agreed to take on what he called his little birds. And the little birds were the messengers that would bring me messages and take messages for me. He taught me a 26-letter cipher in order for me to write in code the message I wished to send, and he was the only one who had a copy of the cipher and could decipher it on the other end. Well, he soon resigned his rank in the Union Army and went over and joined General Beauregard. He was soon promoted to Lieutenant Colonel. And by mid-July, I was sending messages across the lines every day by those little birds of mine. My most important message I sent on the 10th. I had found out through those feminine wiles I mentioned, Mr. Senator Wilson of Massachusetts was one who talked a lot when he was in his cups. And he had provided me with a copy of the order from McDowell himself. Well, I sent the information by this little bird of mine named Miss Betty Duval. Maybe you've heard of her. She's practically famous now. The only way we could devise to get the messages across the lines was sewed them into a little black silk pouch and put them in her hair. And then she drove her vegetable wagon across the bridge. The soldiers checking everything about the wagon and all around, but they never thought to look in her hair. And in that way I sent that most important message about how many troops and when to expect them. And then, a few days after, I got word that the Grand Army planned on cutting the railroad to Manassas. And I knew that General Beauregard was relying on having 2 armies there to meet the Yankees. And so I sent another message by Miss Betty Duval. And by 8 o'clock that night, I got a message back, "Let them come, we are ready." And it said, "Send all the information you can. Anything you think important. Continue to send messages." And so I did. Well, about that time, my daughter Gertrude was going to join her sister Florence in California, and I was taking her to New York City to board a packet ship. So we left from Washington City, little Rose and Gertrude and I, and when we reached New York City, there was the news that there was great rejoicing in Washington, that there had been a grand Union victory at Manassas. Well, my heart sank. I thought, my young country has already failed, even with all the information that I had sent. How could this be? That General Beauregard had failed in his mission at Manassas. But then, on the train back, before we reached Baltimore, we got word there had been no Union victory at Manassas. There had been a great Confederate victory at Manassas. One of the soldiers approached me on the train and he said, "Madam, you should disembark in Baltimore because, you see, we fear that the rebels will be in Washington City when we arrive." Well, I told him that I hoped they were, that those were my people. Sadly, it was not so. Well, that soldier did not speak to me again the entire trip. When we reached Washington, once again, I gathered information every day, and those little birds of mine would bring the messages to me, and I would write them in cipher and send a message, at least one a day across, with any little tidbit of information. And as I've said, I made no secret of where my sympathies lied. And so I fear I became quite careless. On over into August, on one of the hottest days, in the evening, we had the parlor windows open, and I was talking to one little bird of mine about things that no one should have probably been hearing. And I noticed a man peering in my parlor window. The only reason I noticed him was because he clumsily fell off of the shoulders of the man that he was standing on. It was at that time that I realized that someone was watching me. So I tried to be a bit more careful, but it seems the damage had been done. On August the 23rd, the morning of, Miss Duval and I were out for our morning walk, our morning constitution. And one little bird of mine met me on the sidewalk there, and she said, "Do you realize your house was watched last night?" I said, "Yes." "Yes." She said, "Do you know that there are two men following you?" "Yes, I was aware the two men were following me. One was dressed in civilian clothes, who I did not know, and the other was in the fatigues of the Union Army, who was known in the city as Major Allen." Well, Major Allen was not who he seemed to be. But at that time, I told that little bird of mine, "If you see me raise my handkerchief to my mouth, I'm to be arrested. You go and give the information." And so I approached my home, my friend with me, and the two men came and stood on either side of me, one at my elbow on the right and one on the left. And the man in the fatigues of the Union Army, Major Allen, he said, "Is this Mrs. Greenhow?" And I said, "Yes," with much more bluster than I had. "Who are you and what do you want?" And he said, "I've come to arrest you." Well, with that, I raised my handkerchief to my mouth, and I put my copy of my cipher in my mouth and I chewed it up. And it was gone. And then I said, "By whose authority do you arrest me?" show me your warrant. He mumbled something about having sufficient authority from the state and the War Department, and mumbled on and had no warrant. Could show me no warrant. But he took me by the elbow, and the other man by my other elbow, and they escorted me into my own home. And once I got inside, I told him that had I been in my house when they arrested me, that I would have took my little pistol and shot at least one of them dead before they had done such an outrageous and illegal act against my rights. But I did not have my pistol. Well, I asked them then, what do you intend to do? And the one who was known as Major Allen, who you may have figured out by now was none other than Allen Pinkerton, said, search. We're going to search. Well, I knew that I did have certain papers in my home that were incriminating, but I thought that I had them well hidden. They searched every piece of paper that hadn't seen the light of day in 10 years, the scribblings of my children. They searched all the upholstered furniture, the mattresses, the pillows, even my dirty linens. They ripped and tore every piece of furniture in my house. And they descended on my house like rats. And they held me and Miss McCall and little Rose and my Irish maidservant Lizzie there overnight, the first night. Miss McCall being innocent and not knowing anything of it. That next morning, the night before, my guards had become vulgarly drunk. And I had overheard them talking about how they planned on having nice times with the women prisoners. Well, Miss McCall and I devised a way to retrieve some papers that I knew were on the top shelf in my library and to sneak them out of my house. The next morning she was released because, as I said, she was innocent. Well, the only way we could figure on getting those papers out of the house, oh my, that is a strange bird. We put them in her stockings. Well, aren't you scandalized? I'm really not sure where his loyalty lies. He may be as fast sneaking in front of the blockade with us, you never know. But yes, we snuck them out of the house in her stockings. That was the only way we could get them out. But those men who had searched had found these scraps of paper that I had foolishly deciphered right on the page, but had burned in the grate. Just a few little tidbits were left, and they said that was their evidence that I was a spy. Well, I was a spy, but they had no evidence, and I knew my rights. So I asked for a lawyer. Well, I was told that I was not to be given the right to a lawyer. Well, the first week I was allowed visitors, and friend and foe came to visit, of course, some just to see what I had been arrested for. Of course, that first day, I needn't have raised my handkerchief to my mouth, because as soon as I got in the house and little Rose found out, she ran out the back door and up on the back gate and announced to the neighborhood, "Mother has been arrested! Mother has been arrested!" And so that is why folks began to come to visit to find out what was happening. In that first week, I received my visitors. Well, I asked for the benefit of clergy, but I was told that I was not to be given that right as well. So no lawyer, no clergy. And after the first week, they ceased allowing me to have visitors because they determined that I was still passing messages. Well, I was still passing messages. But after that, we had been relegated to one room of my house. And they started bringing in other women prisoners and housing them in my private home where they had given me the use of one room. But I had yet to see a warrant. No charges had been filed against me. And I had been detained against my rights as a citizen. Well, after that first week, my home became known as Fort Greenhow. And some of those women that they brought in, of course, were spies for them and tried to trick me into telling secrets to them. But I trusted no one. On over into November now, I was arrested on August the 23rd, a Friday. By November the 1st, I had yet to see a lawyer, had yet to see charges or a warrant. And so I wrote a scathing letter to Mr. Secretary Seward, telling him just what I thought about being imprisoned in my own home. And I asked that he give me at least the use of one other room in my own house, which apparently it must have worked, because just a few days later, we were allowed, and I say we, not myself, but Lizzie, my maidservant, and Little Rose were allowed in the adjoining room. I was not to be allowed to go in that room, though, because, you see, there was a window. And they were afraid that I would continue to pass messages by talking with my hands. They thought that I could talk with my hands. Well, I could talk with my hands. But don't they know, Lizzie was a faithful Southerner who had to go to market at least once a week. She continued to take messages for me. And Little Rose, at only 8 years old, was so smart and quick, she was able to talk with her hands at that very window. Well, on over into January, I had been detained since August the 23rd. Still no charges, still no warrant. And apparently Mr. Pinkerton was not happy with my situation, because he came and informed me that on January the 18th, that Little Rose and I were to be moved to a prison. Well, in January, of course, I thought that I must be going to be moved to some far-off frozen place in the north, some Yankee torturous prison. But what happened was probably worse. Luckily, I had made friends with the captain of the guard, or we would have been moved in an open wagon. But he arranged for us to move in a closed stage. But we had 2 hours to pack our things. And then they took us to what was once my aunt's boarding house and was now the old Capitol prison. So that place where I was happy and grew up became my prison. We were put into a room about 10 foot by 12 foot in the upper left-hand corner. It had a narrow bed, dirty linens, and a pillow that probably came over on the Mayflower, a glass, a small table, and 2 straight chairs. Oh, but it had a blessed window. But then the next day, Mr. Pinkerton sent a carpenter to board up the window. After a few weeks there, Little Rose came down with camp fever, and I wouldn't allow the doctor to touch her. Didn't trust him. And there was always a guard at our door, even through our necessities. The door was kept open at all times. And that guard, the daytime guard would charge visitors $10 each for a view of the indomitable rebel, Wild Rose, they called him. $10 each to file past our door and peek in at a poor woman prison. We soon discovered that on the floor beneath us were Confederate prisoners of war. And some of the good women of the city would bring them fruits and vegetables to eat. And while the guard was on supper breaks, I had prized up the floorboards in the corner of the room and would pass little Rose down to them, and they would share their fruits and vegetables with her and then hand her back up through the floorboards to her mother. Well, they wanted to allow little Rose out into the yard alone. Well, I forbade it. But after spending from January to March in our prison cell, I got word that we were to be brought before the Commission on Civilian Prisoners. Well, this commission was made up of two men, and both of whom I had known before the war, and so they both knew what my views were. They had a proposal for me. They decided that they would offer me that if I would sign the oath of allegiance, and that I had to agree not to make fun of Mr. Lincoln anymore, that they would release me. Well, I just could not see signing or agreeing to not make fun of Mr. Lincoln. So I declined their deal. I believe that they had come to realize they could not take me to court. They knew that what they had done was illegal, and so they offered me another deal. This time, they said that if I would sign a parole stating that I would not set foot on northern soil again while the war was on, that they would exile me south. Well, what a punishment to be exiled south. I signed the parole. But it still took them from the first week of March until May the 31st to release us. But on the 31st of May, little Rose and I were taken to Fortress Monroe, and then we were escorted across to Richmond, where we were greeted as heroines and lauded in the streets. And that very first night, I received a visit from President Jefferson Davis himself. And his first words to me were, "But for you, there would have been no battle at Bull Run." This was the proudest moment of my life, being lifted up by this man who we hold before the world as our emblem of freedom. The next year, I nursed the soldiers in the hospitals there in Richmond. I knit socks and I rolled bandages. I did all the things that the ladies in Richmond were already doing for the soldiers. And I wrote my memoirs. And I called my book "The First Year of Abolition Rule in Washington and My Imprisonment." About a year after my first visit from President Davis, he came to see me again. And he asked me if I would go to Europe as an unofficial emissary for the Confederacy to ask France and England to come into the war on our account. Imagine that, the very first American woman ambassador. Of course I said yes, but I was proud to be asked and humbled that my president had requested it of me. He entrusted certain papers for the ambassadors to be taken with me, and I brought little Rose. And on that first voyage when I ran the blockade out of Wilmington, I was on a ship called the Phantom. And I prayed it would be like a ghost and get past all the blockaders. But we were fired on. They spotted us. But we made it through. And I was seasick the entire voyage, just like this time. But once I reached England, after kissing the ground, I was received at the court of Queen Victoria herself, and then at Napoleon III in France. About 3 months after I arrived, I published my memoirs. In this valise, I have $3,000 in gold. I'm going to give it to the Confederate Treasury. I'm going to give it to President Davis to use for the government. It's the proceeds from the sale of my book. While I was in Paris, I did the hardest thing that I have ever done. I took little Rose to the convent of the Sacred Heart, and I left her there for her safety and her education. But when I left, that was when I had that foreboding, sick feeling come over me that I might never see her again. And so when we boarded the Condor, I questioned Captain Hewitt over there about this ship and whether or not he felt that we would come through the blockade. And he said that it was a new ship, painted gray and low slung in the water, and that we were sure to sneak by. And then when we got to Nova Scotia and you all got on, it was a full moon. And so when we reached Wilmington, we couldn't just run right up into the mouth of the Cape Fear. We've been circling. And that's what Captain Hewitt has told me, that's why we've been on this ship as long as we have. Because of the full moon. We were bound to be spotted if we had come through any sooner. But I can see the lights now of Fort Fisher from here. Captain Hewitt has told me we're only about 3 miles out, and by morning we will reach the docks. So I'm certain that by then we'll be able to get by the blockaders. Did you hear that? Did you hear that? I've heard that before. That was cannon fire. I know what that sounds like. Did you hear that cannon? We've been spotted. Oh no. I can't be arrested again. What if they board our ship? Captain Hewitt has said that we've run aground on something here that he thinks it's a sandbar. But that by morning, when the tide comes in, that it'll lift the ship up off of whatever it is, a sandbar or whatever it is that has us hung fast, and that we'll be able to continue on into Wilmington. But I'm afraid that they're still firing at us. And they might actually be able to board this ship. So I've asked Captain Hewitt for some volunteers, and 2 young men have stepped forward to row me in a lifeboat to shore. But I'm sure that all of you will be fine here on the Condor, even though I had to argue with Captain Hewitt quite a bit because of the high seas tonight. But I'm sure it's only 3 miles to the shore. I'm sure that I'll be fine. And I'll come and get my trunks in the morning on the docks at Wilmington. I'm sure you good people will be there to meet me in the morning. So I will only take my valise with me. Take my valise with the gold just for safekeeping. And I'm sure I'll see you all in the morning. God be with you. And God be with the South. Anybody not know? The little lifeboat immediately capsized and she sank like a stone. And everybody else lived. Everybody on the ship made it to shore the next morning. And the 2 men who were rowing the boat clung to the keel of it and were brought back onto the Condor. And if she would have just stayed put, she would have been okay. But she was terrified that she was going to be caught again, and she thought that they might hang her. And after Mary Surratt, they may have hung her if they had caught her. I'll take a few questions if we have time. Do we have time? Okay. Anybody have any questions?
I was interested to know about the gold.
You want to know about the gold? Of course, of course.
From other accounts, they always say it was money that Europe had given to send for the Confederates, and this is the first I'd heard that it was her.
It was actually the proceeds from her book. It was her money, and she was given it, but she had money. She had more money than that, you know. But she was one of those that had converted everything to Confederate bonds and all that as well, so she may have been broke at the end of the war if she had lived. But she was a pretty wealthy woman of her time. Think about this, though. How many women of the 1860s that are grown women knew how to swim? Now, how many of those women could swim with a dress like this on? Then put $2,000 or $3,000 in gold around your neck, which it wasn't much. It probably didn't weigh more than about 15 pounds because of the way that the coinage was then. But still, how many of those women could have swum? Then put you in the waters off of Fort Fisher, which is the worst place to swim on the coast of North Carolina I've ever been to. It is rip tides and horrible, and high seas. It was a rough night, and so she just had nothing going for her at all. And the captain should have said, "No way, I don't care how much you beg, lady, no way," and he didn't, he allowed it. So, but she was a very headstrong and bossy woman. She got her way.
Captain knew better than to argue with a woman.
Probably so, but it didn't turn out well for the woman.
Her body was eventually found.
Her body was found the very next morning, and the gold was found the very next morning.
Where's she
But it was separated. She's buried in Oakdale Cemetery in Wilmington, and I had the distinct honor and privilege of doing a program very similar to this at her graveside for her 150th of her death, when the OCR and the UDC put a stone there to commemorate the sesquicentennial of her death. Yes, sir. Little Rose. Well, she had 3 daughters that did live, but little Rose grew up in the convent, and she stayed there until she was of age, and then she came home to America, and we were, of course, it was the 1880s, and reunification, reconstruction, whatever you want to call it, and when she got here, she met and married a federal soldier. Kevin's changed his head. But in the spirit of her mother, she soon divorced him. And in the 1880s, that was unheard of, that a young Catholic woman would divorce. Woo! So it must have been something very scandalous at the time. But after that, she went on the stage with another famous Confederate spy named Belle Boyd. And they told their stories. And little Rose, at 8 years old, had done things that her mother had put her up to. So she was a bona fide spy in her own right. She knew how to pass messages and send secrets through ways that nobody else knew. And so she knew a lot of that stuff. But she had also heard a lot of things that she shouldn't have heard at 8 years old when she was in the prison. And even in her mother's own house when they were imprisoned. And Rose wrote about it in her memoirs that little Rose had heard and seen things that no child should see. And so when she started reliving that on the stage, it became too much for her, and she went back to the convent, and I have found no trace of her after that. So I think she stayed there the rest of her life. But her daughter Florence had married Treadwell Moore Jr. prior to the war. In the late 1850s, she had married, and he had been stationed out in California. So he wasn't exactly fighting in the war, but Rose did not approve. She was not happy that her daughter was married to a Union soldier during the war. But that is where she has a descendants today from her oldest daughter, Florence, who had children. Her middle daughter, Gertrude, did not have any children, and little Rose did not have any children. So, but there are descendants today, I think, that are in the SCB and the UDC and the OCR and maybe MOS&B, I'm not sure.
How old was she when she died?
Rose never told anybody how old she was.
But surely,
Really?
Surely they knew when she was born.
Well, it is written that she was born in 1817, but she never confirmed nor denied. She did not believe in telling anyone her age. Robert, her husband, when she married, she was 26 and he was 43. So she married a much older man than she was. Y'all want to know more about the gold? Sure. You asked about the gold. The gold was found the very next morning. Now, how does gold wash ashore the very next morning? I want to know. But the man who found it was a Confederate soldier. He was on picket duty. And it is said that he was the shortest soldier with the longest name in the Confederate Army. Gosh, if I can remember his name. It's a bunch of initials. It's D.R. Robert something Duval, something, another. I mean, just on and on and on it goes. And he could barely shoulder a musket. But by 1864, we were taking anybody that could take a musket. He was about 4 foot tall. I mean, you could barely hold a long rifle or a musket. So when he found the gold in this valise, which may have been similar to this was just an example that I had made, he hid it because he thought, oh, I found some gold, But then he heard that Mrs. Greenhow was missing. And he knew that it had to be related to Mrs. Greenhow. And there were papers in it that were to President Davis and that sort of thing. And so he came forward to his commanding officer with the valise. And there's several versions of where the gold went to. There's a version that it went to Jefferson Davis and went into the Treasury. Then there's the version that it's still lost, that you'll see her ghost out on the beach at Fort Fisher walking, looking for the gold. I've heard that, and I've talked to people who have seen a woman in a black dressed similar to this, walking on the beach. Not me, although I've been out there walking on the beach like this several times. And then there's the version of the commanding officer's family came into some money during the war. So we don't know exactly what happened to the gold. Her trunks, though, that were left on the ship, the Condor, were retrieved and wound up in the archives in Raleigh, North Carolina, because the governor, after the war, bid on them at auction. And then he died while in office. And all of his possessions were put into the archives. Well, this trunk full of things and her journal that she kept while she was in Europe had been in the archives for over 100 years. And sometime in the late 90s, early 2000s, somebody went into that trunk and discovered that there was Rose O'Neal Greenhow's journal. And they opened it up and read, oh, these are her notes about her trip to Europe. And she kept it all the way on the way back. And in it there was a message to little Rose about how she had endured all the travesties that had been put on them by Lincoln, and for her not to ever forget what they had been through. So little Rose did suffer with her mother. It was completely against her rights as a citizen. I don't care how big of a spy you are. If they don't have a warrant and give you a lawyer, how could she be held? She was held, though, almost 10 months.
And they would not allow her a pastor?
No, and she was a Catholic, as I said, and even a soldier on the battlefield. If you take a prisoner of war, you allow clergy. That's the benefit of clergy is, and she was denied that as well. Very mistreated. Anybody else have any questions about Wild Rebel Rose? No? Will, I thought you'd be full of questions. Pretty good? Okay, good. Well, I hope y'all will have me come back. I enjoy coming to Virginia to perform as Mrs. Stonewall Jackson. I know Kevin's seen Mrs. Jackson, probably twice. I'm not sure who else. I know Jackie and Bill have seen Mrs. Jackson. I don't know if anybody else has, but I'd always love to come back and see y'all again sometime. So, yes, sir.
You might tell them where the OCR took their name.
Oh, the Order of Confederate Rose is named for Rose O'Neal Greenhow. That is right.
Where is Jackson Springs?
Jackson Springs is near Pinehurst. If you're a golfer, I'm about 10 minutes from Pinehurst. If there had been no Jackson Springs, there would be no Pinehurst because people were coming there to take the waters. And we let Yankees come there to take the waters. And then next thing we know, there's a Pinehurst with just full of Yankees. No, they were spending their money, so.
Money spent.
Money, hey. Well, that was what it was after the war. We did have a booming economy because of the Yankees coming there to take the waters, and we're in the pine trees. So it's right in the middle of the sand hills of North Carolina. But it was supposedly good for the tuberculosis. The consumptives came there to take the water from the pine scented air, which didn't cure anybody of anything. But any other questions? Anybody? Well, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed